I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today is all about yarn mops. Whenever I'm dyeing yarn and I have extra dye that I want to use up, whether it is in a kettle and I want to like soak it out to reuse that dye bath, or it's on the countertop from speckling, or even on my gloved fingertips, the new extra colorway that I'm creating with this leftover dye, I tend to refer to as a yarn mop. Sometimes I leave no dye behind skein, but really I call it a yarn mop if I'm using it to collect any dye that otherwise might get tossed down the drain. And so today we're gonna make some yarn mops on purpose and then talk about different ways that you can heat set those mops to create slightly different effects. But in particular, we're focusing on the type of yarn mop that results from me having dry dye powder on my fingertips and wiping that onto the skein of yarn. But before I talk more about yarn mops, I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to today's lab partner, Amy Lipkowitz. Amy, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly, and I really hope you'll love your yarn. When I have a yarn mop and I've randomly applied dry dye powder to it, sometimes this is even off camera when I'm speckling because it's not the main focus of the video. But when I'm doing this, there are really three different ways that I might choose to heat set this in the end. The most common way that I would heat set it would be to steam set it. I'll set up a steamer basket, steam it for 30 minutes, we're good to go. But there are two other ways that sometimes I choose to set the color. One of them is to immerse the skein into a dye bath or a kettle, really kettle dyeing it, and quickly adding it in, and sometimes some of the colors will spread out, sometimes they may not. It depends on how long the dye has been sitting on the yarn, but this overall tends to soften and blend the colors slightly more. And then I figured we'd throw one more technique in and we'll dip dye the yarn, which similar to kettle dyeing in many ways, but because I'm going to be moving the yarn more as I add it to our dye bath, this might blend some of the colors a little differently, and so we may or may not see some differences between the two. So let's go check out the color palette for today. For the intentional yarn mops today, I decided on, I guess, a very me color palette. We're going to use some DHarma Dark Navy, Electric Violet, Caribbean Blue, and Emerald Green. Now, of these colors, I know that Emerald Green will likely spread. Same with the Caribbean Blue. Those are both colors that strike a little bit slower, which isn't to say that the purple and navy won't spread, but I know the Emerald Green is a big spreader, and Caribbean Blue can be as well. And so this should give us a difference between the different treatments we're doing with our yarn mops. For our yarn today, we are going to dye 300 grams of Wool2Dye4's Krypton Sock. This yarn is 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon. It is a 3-ply fingering weight yarn and it is so soft, and I've been very happy with how it's dyed up. Even though I haven't used it in too many different projects, I'm going to go add some removable nylon zip ties onto this yarn and pre-soak it for at least 30 minutes so the yarn is nice and saturated. Even though sometimes when I'm dealing with yarn mops, I don't bother pre-soaking them much at all. I just sort of dunk them in some water with some acid. We'll let this yarn have some time to get nice and saturated. Here is our pre-soaking yarn, and I'm gonna add 3 tablespoons of white vinegar to it. This is 5% vinegar, sometimes people ask. And I don't know how much water volume is really in here, but it doesn't matter a ton. I find, and you'll figure out what ratios of vinegar to water to yarn make sense for your tap water. My tap water starts out as slightly acidic. So if I was going to do the yarn mops with no acid in them at all, then some colors might start striking, some won't, but some will likely start striking to our yarn that we have here today. But now I'm actually going to remove the yarn. It doesn't need to stay in with the acid for very long at all. This is just a couple minutes. And I'm going to remove a reasonable amount of the water that's in here. Set the yarn aside. I'm going to go set this aside. And I'm just going to sort of put the yarn here in my pan. Actually, I'm going to do this more like I would if I was actually doing a yarn mop and have it sort of folded over. I'm just using the pan today so I don't make as much of a mess on the countertop. But now I'm going to go put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves, and we'll start mopping. Now I'm going to start, I guess, with the Caribbean blue. Now I'm going to go in, pinch dye like I might to speckle, and then kind of rub it onto my fingers. So there's just a little bit of color on the fingertips. And now I'm going to wipe this onto just one of the skeins in a very kind of random placement. Now my gloved hand is now wet and I don't want to put this back in the jar. So I do need to make sure to dry it completely. If I was going to be doing like a lot of quote yarn mops, then I would go ahead and I would probably remove some of the dye powder and put it into another container before starting this. And you can see I'm like, oh, I got some on that other finger. And it's all about just sort of wiping it off. I'll probably go through each color maybe twice. It depends on the overall coverage that we get. But one of the goals is to avoid introducing too much moisture into the jar and not to come over with too much dye. We do have a little bit. Before I even finish that, I'm going to close our blue. And we're just looking for white patches where I can wipe the yarn. And if the color feels too dark in an area, sometimes I will press it, just like I did there. And then I can sort of shift the way the yarn is before we go into the next color. And there is some dye in the pan. If we want, we can rub the yarn with that later on. That is all, I mean, everything's all up to me, right? But the Caribbean blue is spreading out a lot. Okay, this is dark navy, which is a lovely pigmented color. But I'm finding that that was a lot easier to wipe off. Different powders have different textures. Some of them are a little bit fluffier, some are a little bit drier, and depending on the texture, they may or may not stick to the yarn quite as well. But yeah, you can see here that the navy is coming off of my gloves a lot faster. And even in picking up that yarn, I got some Caribbean blue on my hand, on my other hand. So we might go into the navy like one more time after this, but we'll see what we have in the end. And sometimes when I do mops like this, in the middle of the entire process, I'll go ahead and steam set the yarn just to help, I don't know, the colors stick. And so I am going to lift the yarn. I'm looking for large white patches, and that sort of tells me where I might want to add more color. I don't always move it all the time, but I do often try to sort of like shift and move the yarn in between different colors. Okay, electric violet. Ooh, there is a big clump of something in here. I'm using this opportunity to try to break that clump up. Did not do a perfect job there. But now I have a lot of this color on my hand. I'm really just trying to wipe it off. And there's a little more. Why not go onto a slightly different one? Ooh, these colors are so pretty. But I do know that as I go into the emerald green, that'll probably spread a bit like the Caribbean blue did.
So one time through might be enough. And so some projects use like a lot of yarn mops, and sometimes I can use the same yarn mop for a while. That really does depend on how well the mops are soaking up the dye. And so this Caribbean blue is going to be a little bit trickier. But see, I can move the yarn and be like, oh, okay, there's a lot of white over here. And sometimes the patches can be big, sometimes small. It just, a lot of times I'm really not thinking about the placement and the colors that I'm adding. And I don't really look at where everything is until the end. But that really does depend on the project I'm working on. But I will say for now that this is a set that I might go and steam set like before in the middle. Just, I mean, I'm not going to today. This is our emerald. But I might be inclined to go steam set it just to make sure that I can keep adding and layering color. But obviously today we're going to heat set with different techniques. Now, depending on my project, there are times, exposing white areas, there are times when I might be working on a dyeing project and I don't want to have any acid in the yarn mop, because if I'm touching the mop and touching my yarn back and forth, I may not want to introduce any acid into the project, depending on how the technique is going. And so some of those are the circumstances where I might decide to dip dye or kettle dye the skein after, because that's a circumstance where I'm like, oh goodness, I have this yarn mop, but there's not acid in it yet. Oh, I have a dye bath over here that does have acid in it. Okay, perfect, let's go. We'll take care of this here. And so that's how that can happen. Okay, so now that we've finished the green, looking at this, I think the only color I'm inclined to add more of is the navy. But let's see, and I can move the zip tie and see if there's a spot that I in particular feel like it needs a little bit more color. But it's hard to say sometimes because things can be a little random, and that's okay. I do have some water heating up on the stovetop right now, and we'll be using that momentarily to kettle dye. So the yarn isn't going to be sitting for long periods of time, just a little bit. And the yarn is getting more color and stuff as it touches itself, as it touches its neighbors. Again, this is all pretty random. Oh, I almost forgot. Okay. I think that that's pretty good. Can I not screw this lid on? There we go. All right, let's see. We do have some dye in the pan. And I'm like, yeah, see, if I try to wipe it up, I'm just going to spread things out a lot. So let's go ahead and pick this skein right here. This will be our yarn mop that we steam set. Let's go ahead and we'll dip dye this one and we'll kettle dye that one. Okay, in my kettle dye dye bath, I've got 16 cups of water. I'm going to add 3 tablespoons of white vinegar. And I'm doing this in the other dye bath that I have set up, same amount. And I actually changed my mind. With this one I'm going to use for dip dyeing, and let's use the other one for kettle dyeing. This is my 12-quart pot. The other one is 8-quart, and so it's a little shallower. And so for the kettle dyeing, I'm putting the yarn in, moving it a little bit, and then boom, just letting it stay. You can see that we've got a lot of color sort of blooming in here. It is very, very pretty. I wonder what the average color is. I mean, it's sort of like a blue. I'm just sort of tapping things down just a little bit, but you can also see that colors are sort of staying where they were placed as well. So I'm only going to stick the cover on. It doesn't really need to be covered, but because I have it here, why not? I'm going to heat this for 30 minutes. Okay, let's dip dye. We don't really have any dry powder around anymore, but I'm still wearing my mask. I'll take it off eventually. And so this time, as we dip dye and move the yarn, we see some colors come out. And so like as we add more and more yarn, more dye will enter the dye bath, but also we might have less. And so there's enough water volume that in our kettle dye pot, if the water, with whatever dye comes out, it likely isn't going to move that far. Ooh, this is really pretty. I do have a video where I added dry dye, a couple videos where I added dry dye onto yarn and then dip dyed it. Oh, the results are pretty because you see like we're getting spread, but we're also maintaining a lot of the colors where they were placed. And the color that's spreading is a super, super lovely blue. Now, at the lightest end, I picked this one for dip dyeing because the lightest end is a little bit light. There's some green up there. But my goal is to have more of the background color, hopefully be mostly at one end. But ultimately, the colors that are spreading are incredibly pastel. Like, there's not that much pigment that's coming out. There's very little pigment that is left here in the kettle. And so I don't know if it's going to be obvious, the dip dyed skein versus the kettle dyed skein, but I was just curious to see what we would get. And so I'm going to leave this all in now, and this is also going to heat for 30 minutes. And as for our final yarn mop, well, we're going to steam set her. And yes, there is some color that is left in the pan. We will likely be just leaving that. But this yarn is going to just sit here for a while until a steamer basket opens up.
It was taking all of my self-control to not take that yarn mop and wipe it through the pan more, but I'm trying to treat them similarly, so I don't want to do that. Now, in the 12-quart pot, I could add a little steaming basket on top of the yarn that is kettle dyeing and then start steaming this yarn right now. The reason why I'm not doing that is that occasionally, as the steam goes into the steamer basket and sort of condenses up there, sometimes liquid will drip back down. And occasionally the liquid that drips back down brings some dye with it. And so I don't want to alter our experiment at all today. And so I don't want conceivably a tiny amount of dye to drip down and then sort of alter the results we're getting of our kettle dyed yarn. And so there's no harm having the yarn mop sit and wait. I mean, you can see that so much of the dye already was sort of not set necessarily, but in place of where we had placed it before even adding it in. If that dye had not set at all, once we added it to the hot water, it would have just sort of all disappeared. And that's something we might have seen with yarn that is non-superwash. But anyway, I'll be back when the timer goes off and we can see what our yarn's doing. Okay, we are gonna remove our kettle dyed. Where's the zip tie? Come on, zip tie. Here we go. Ooh, so I would say there are areas in the backdrop, it reads fairly green, but that could be about the green, but I do see some like tonal variation from where those colors spread. Interesting. Of course, if the yarn feels more green or more blue, may not have anything to do with the heat technique. It could have to do with how much dye was there. Okay, and now I'm gonna bring over a steamer basket and our yarn mop here. Popping it in. And we're gonna steam this for 30 minutes. That mint color we got is super pretty. Okay, I'm gonna turn off the heat here. This was our dip dyed colorway. And I don't know, you guys. It's funny because I think you could argue that dip dyeing is very similar to the kettle dyeing with this, and I may not be able to tell them apart later, except the dip dyed one has a 3 on it. So we know that. But let me see if I can show you side by side. Okay, can you tell the difference between the kettle dyed and the dip dyed? Can you? Well, you can see the number 3 maybe. So this is our dip dyed colorway, and I would say we don't have white, but it is more pastel up here. However, the way that this one is laid out, this end seems to have more pastels to it as well. But maybe in the middle, there are more like deeper colors, and this, you know, there's less, the color on the background is more like an average of everything. Whereas here, I see, okay, it's a little bit more blue there, a little bit more green spread there. Things are a little bit more localized. The differences are extremely, extremely subtle. And again, would depend a lot on the different pigments that you're using for your project. But anyway, I'm gonna set this aside to cool and we'll wait for our other yarn mop. Anyone else time out their beeping timer, or is that just me? All right, it has been 30 minutes, and notice that we still have white in our yarn, even though we're underexposed so you can't see. But I am going to turn off the heat, remove the yarn, let it cool, and then we'll probably wash everything all together. Let's wash all 3 skeins together. And I'm curious now if I'm holding up, which you can't really see. I mean, I do sort of feel a difference between the dip dyed skein and the other one. It's super subtle. And again, all those differences could just be the result of how like the dye was wiped on, even though we did get similar amounts of dye on all of the yarn. Ooh, but the Krypton is so soft. Now, there's no question that these yarns would look really well in a project together. Maybe the dip dyed and the kettle dyed are a little too similar, but like different enough that like it's not quite the same, but the other yarn mop would work well with any of them with the other background. But anyway, we might have bleeding. I don't know. I always make sure at this stage to make sure even the zip ties get well saturated, because we could have some dry dye on the surface. Although actually, of our kettle dyed and dip dyed yarn, we're unlikely to. And I'm not seeing any bleeding. But the reason why we're unlikely to in those is we've already submerged the yarn. So if there was some dye sort of on the surface, it would have had a chance to come into contact with water and dissolve. Occasionally, you get a large clump of dye on your yarn and it just can't dissolve all the way. And so sometimes some bleeding can just literally be excess dye like that. But other times it can be that there's just too much dye for what the yarn can handle, and then you might see bleeding. But none of that really matters because there's not bleeding here now. So I'm gonna go put the yarn through my spin dryer and hang it up to dry. Here's our finished yarn, and I'm really glad that I have a notation on the zip ties, which one is the dip dyed skein versus the kettle dyed skein. I am gonna have to go and double check my notes, because I could really, in my mind, make up a case for either one of these being the dip dyed one. Because on one hand, this one has more localized color, like where it's placed, and is a little bit more even toned throughout. Here things are a little bit more blended. And so I could make an argument for the more blending being the dip dyed, because also it gets a little bit lighter up there. but I could also make an argument for this being the dip dyed. Oh no. I am gonna go check. But while I check, let me know which one you think is which. Oh my gosh. I may not be able to tell them apart later, except the dip dyed one has a 3 on it. So we know that. This is the dip dyed skein. It has the 3 on it. Now, if we look at the dip dyed skein, you definitely can see the background getting lighter as we get closer to the top. The background color here feels also a little bit more even, whereas some areas are a little bit more blue or a little bit more green, and there's lighter and lighter areas that vary a little bit. Ultimately, these two techniques are very, very similar, and if I were to do this again, it's possible we wouldn't be able to tell the difference really at all in the end. But again, the main difference here is because we're moving the yarn so much more for the dip dyeing, that allows whatever color's coming off to really dissolve and move throughout the dye bath versus staying a little bit more local and then being captured by the yarn that is more nearby. Like looking at this, I also feel more of a softness, I think, especially with the green. Like there's areas still of the green, but I feel a lot more of the green in here. And I don't think it's because there's less green here. I think it's because that color just takes longer to strike. Now, of these 3 colorways, if I were gonna pick a favorite, and the only reason why I must pick a favorite is because I need to pick which one I want to send to Amy, today's lab partner. And so I think of these 3, my favorite has to be the full immersion kettle dyed skein. Don't get me wrong, I love the classic yarn mop, I love the dip dyed skein, but I am enjoying the balance of both the softness we have here with the more contrast between the different colors. And so this is softer than steaming, it's a little bit less soft than the dip dyeing, and so it's sort of the perfect midpoint today. With the yarn twisted up, the differences between the kettle dyed and dip dyed are even more subtle. And I should add that dip dyeing is technically a form of kettle dyeing. However, when I refer to something as kettle dyed, I usually refer to it just being in the dye kettle the whole time versus adding and removing parts of the yarn to it like I do with dip dyeing. So I'd say just about all dip dyeing is related to kettle dyeing, but not all kettle dyeing is dip dyeing. Amy Lipkowitz, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. I really hope that you've both enjoyed the video and that you're gonna love your yarn. If you want to learn more about how you can become a lab partner like Amy, go and check out the lab partner listings in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. There's 2 different ways you can become a lab partner. You can sign up for the classic Dyepot Weekly lab partner where you get to pick the yarn base, tell me some colors to avoid, and then I'll film a video with you in mind. Or you can look at a list of videos that I've already filmed but not edited and become a last minute lab partner where I'll film shout outs to you after the video, rest of the dyeing filming has already been finished. And so that's the main difference with the last minute lab partner. You get to go and pick the yarn base, but also you can see the video theme. Whereas if I am dyeing the yarn with you in mind, the final colorway and the technique used will be a little bit more of a surprise. But anyway, Amy, thank you so much for being my lab partner today. And of course, don't forget to check out the rest of the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop, filled with hand-dyed yarn featured in my videos. And there's a really awesome ChemKnits Hanukkah yarn sampler that either is going to start shipping really, really soon or is ready to ship now. At the time I'm filming this video, I'm not quite sure. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching.